I simply cannot find her.
Maria?
She's missing from the Abbey again.
Perhaps we should have put a cowbell around her neck.
I have looked everywhere, in all of the usual places.
Considering that it's Maria, I suggest you look in someplace unusual.
There's a kiss in this film that took nearly a dozen tries to get right. Not because the actors couldn't act, but because a piece of studio equipment kept making a sound so ridiculous that two grown professionals fell apart laughing every single time they got close enough to say I love you. There's a 5-year-old girl who went under the water twice on camera while the crew scrambled to pull her out. There's a leading man who hated the film so much he gave it a nickname too crude to say out loud, and who was so drunk during one of its most beloved songs that he could barely stand. And there's a voice you have heard 1,000 times that never actually belonged to the man on screen. None of this made it into the official story for decades. Stay with me, because by the end of this, you will never watch this movie the same way again. Before any of this could happen, there had to be a movie at all, and that almost didn't happen either. The real story begins not in Hollywood, but in West Germany in the mid-1950s, when a producer named Wolfgang Liebeneiner adapted Maria von Trapp's memoir into 2 low-budget German films. They were sentimental, they were modest in scale, and by American standards, they looked almost amateurish. But in post-war Europe, audiences were starving for something hopeful, and the films became enormous hits, spreading across the continent and into South America. When American studio executives eventually saw them, the reaction was closer to embarrassment than excitement. The general opinion in Hollywood was that the films looked like a school pageant, not a movie. Nobody wanted to touch it until a director named Vincent J. Donahue watched the German films while scouting project for Paramount and saw something the others had missed. He didn't think it belonged on a movie screen at all. He thought it belonged on Broadway, and he thought there was only one woman who should play the lead, the biggest stage star in America, Mary Martin. That idea only worked because of a decision Maria von Trapp had made years earlier that, in hindsight, cost her family a fortune. She had no agent, no entertainment lawyer, nobody guiding her through the business side of Hollywood. When German filmmakers first approached her about the rights to her life story, she agreed to a flat one-time payment of $9,000, which today would be worth somewhere around $100,000. It was a modest sum even then, and it would end up being a tiny fraction of what her story eventually generated. When American producers later tried to simply buy the title of her book and adapt something loosely inspired by it, she refused, insisting that if her family story was going to be told at all, it needed to be told honestly. Tracking Maria down to even ask her about a Broadway musical turned into its own small saga. By the time Mary Martin and her husband, producer Richard Halliday, were seriously pursuing the project, Maria was thousands of miles away doing missionary work in Papua New Guinea alongside Father Franz Wasner, the family's longtime musical director. She had no reliable way to receive mail, and by her own account, she often didn't even open the letters that piled up from a couple in America who kept writing to her about Broadway. It wasn't until she and Father Wasner returned to the United States by ship, docking in San Francisco, that Richard Halliday met her in person, handed her 2 tickets to see his wife perform in Annie, Get Your Gun, and finally got her attention. Maria was moved by the performance, but she had to explain that she had already sold the film rights to a German company years before. Still, she told the couple they were welcome to try anyway. That casual green light is the reason any of what follows exists at all. Even then, the musical almost turned out completely differently. The original plan was to weave in real Austrian folk songs the Trapp family had actually performed, stitched together with maybe 1 or 2 new songs. When producers approached Richard Rodgers and Oscar Hammerstein about contributing just a couple of numbers, the 2 men refused to do it halfway. Either they wrote the entire score themselves, or they walked away. That ultimatum reshaped the entire project, and once Rodgers and Hammerstein finished their prior commitment on Flower Drum Song, they came back and built an entirely original score from scratch, the one that gave the world my favorite things, Do Re Mi, Edelweiss, and Climb Every Mountain. The Broadway production opened in November of 1959 at the Lunt-Fontanne Theater with Mary Martin as Maria, and it became one of the most commercially successful shows of its era, running for well over 4 years. That success set off a bidding war for the film rights, which 20th Century Fox eventually won at a price that seemed almost reckless at the time, especially for a studio that had just been nearly crippled by the runaway budget of Cleopatra. Casting the film brought its own quiet drama, and nowhere more than with the role of Maria herself. Julie Andrews had already proven herself on Broadway as Eliza Doolittle in My Fair Lady. But when it came time to cast the film version, Hollywood decided she wasn't right for the camera and gave the role to Audrey Hepburn instead, whose singing had to be dubbed for the part. It was a bruising professional snub for Andrews, the kind that could have derailed a career. Instead, director Robert Wise saw an early, unfinished cut of Andrews and Mary Poppins and reportedly told his team to sign her before anyone else could. Andrews took the role of Maria for a flat fee, with no royalties and no share of the box office, a very different arrangement from the one Mary Martin had negotiated for the stage version, which had earned her millions from a share of the profits. When Mary Poppins was released and became a massive hit, and Andrews won the Academy Award for Best Actress, the irony wasn't lost on anyone watching, including Andrews herself. Finding her co-star turned into a much longer search. The role of Captain Von Trapp, a stern widowed naval officer who slowly softens, wasn't attracting major stars. Several well-known actors of the era were considered and passed on it before Christopher Plummer accepted, and even then he did so reluctantly. Plummer felt the material was overly sentimental, and he made no secret of his disdain for the project, both during filming and for years afterward, referring to it dismissively in a way that made his true opinion of the script very clear. His frustration wasn't just about the tone of the story. During production, his singing was recorded, but the studio ultimately decided to have a professional vocalist named Bill Lee dub over his vocal performances for the film's release, including the now iconic rendition of Edelweiss. Plummer had trained for the songs and wanted his own voice used, and being replaced stung. For decades, most audiences had no idea and simply assumed the voice they heard singing Edelweiss belonged to Plummer. It wasn't until a deluxe reissue of the soundtrack decades later that Plummer's actual, unreleased vocal takes were finally made public, giving people their first real chance to hear what the studio had quietly set aside. Now for the scene everyone remembers, but almost nobody knows the real story behind. The gazebo, the romantic confession between Maria and the captain, set to the song Something Good, is shot in soft, dim, almost silhouetted light, and generations of viewers assumed that was simply an artistic choice, a way to make the moment feel intimate and dreamlike. The truth is far less poetic. The scene was originally supposed to be lit more conventionally, using large carbon arc lights positioned above the set to simulate soft moonlight through the gazebo's glass windows. Those lights, however, had a serious mechanical flaw. As they heated up, they periodically let out a loud, groaning, flatulent noise, and it happened again and again, right at the exact moments when Julie Andrews and Christopher Plummer leaned in close to deliver the film's most tender lines. Andrews later described the experience herself, recalling how she and Plummer would get face to face, ready to say "I love you" or share the kiss, and the lights would let out what she called a raspberry sound, as if commenting on the scene itself. The two of them could not stop laughing. Take after take collapsed into giggling fits, and by various accounts the crew burned through a dozen or more unusable takes before anyone found a solution. Eventually, the cinematographer and director simply gave up on lighting the scene the traditional way and shot the actors mostly in shadow and silhouette against the glow of the gazebo windows instead, which is the beautiful, moody version audiences have loved for 60 years without ever knowing it was essentially an accident born out of barely contained laughter. That wasn't the only close call inside that same glass gazebo. During the filming of the earlier number 16, going on 17, the young actress playing the eldest daughter, Liesel, had an accident mid-dance and put her foot through one of the set's glass panes, spraining her ankle in the process. The production pushed forward anyway, bandaging the injury, disguising it with makeup, and minimizing it in the edit as much as they could, which is why most viewers have never noticed anything wrong in the finished scene at all. Filming outside the gazebo carried its own risks, and one moment in particular has become one of the most talked about stories to come out of the entire production. During the boat scene, in which the Von Trapp children famously tumble out of a rowboat into the lake. The youngest cast member, 5-year-old Kim Carruth, who played Gretel, could not swim. According to Julie Andrews, the crew only told her this detail moments before filming began, instructing her to reach the little girl quickly if the boat capsized. When the boat actually tipped over, the plan fell apart immediately. Andrews fell backward, away from the child, instead of toward her. Carruth went under the surface, came up, went under a second time, and by Andrews' own recollection had swallowed enough water that she vomited afterward. It took another adult jumping in to help pull her fully clear of danger. Andrews has since called it one of the more frightening moments of the entire shoot, and Carruth herself has said in later interviews that she still isn't especially fond of the water, decades on. Christopher Plummer's discomfort with the film went well beyond having his singing replaced. He was open, particularly in later interviews and in his own memoir, about how disconnected he felt from what he saw as the story's excessive sweetness, and about how he coped with that disconnect during filming, including drinking during parts of the shoot. He would go on to describe himself in his memoir with blunt, unflattering honesty, admitting he approached some of the material with more arrogance than appreciation at the time. What makes this particularly striking is that some of the film's most emotionally resonant moments, including his performance of Edelweiss, were filmed while he later admitted he was not in the clear state of mind, and yet audiences have responded to that same performance as one of the most sincere and moving in the entire film. It took Plummer many years, by his own account, to eventually make peace with the role that had frustrated him so much during production, coming to appreciate what the film meant to so many people, even though it was never the kind of role he set out to be remembered for. Whether turned out to be its own quiet villain throughout the Salzburg shoot. Nobody on the production had accounted for just how unpredictable Austrian rain could be, and 1964 turned out to be an especially wet year in the region. What was budgeted as roughly 6 weeks of location filming stretched out toward double that, with hundreds of cast and crew members waiting out delays, burning through the studio's money in hotel bills, equipment costs, and wages while the skies refused to cooperate. For a studio still reeling financially from the disaster of Cleopatra, the mounting costs on what was supposed to be a modest, wholesome musical created real anxiety inside the studio, with some insiders privately worried the production could become another financial catastrophe rather than the saving grace it eventually turned out to be. Even the director's chair wasn't settled without its own hidden drama. Before Robert Wise ever came aboard, veteran director William Wyler had been attached to the project and had gone as far as stepping down from his position on the Fox board to avoid any conflict of interest, a move that signaled just how seriously the studio was treating the project. But Wyler never fully connected with the material. He found the Broadway show's songs didn't sit naturally with the story for his taste, and he was also privately dealing with hearing loss that made directing a heavily musical production especially difficult. When an opportunity came along to direct a much darker psychological thriller instead, Wyler took the opening, and the official explanation given to the press was simply scheduling conflicts, rather than the full picture of his private doubts. That quiet exit is what eventually opened the door for Robert Wise to take over and guide the film to the version audiences know today. And that version became something almost nobody in the industry predicted. For nearly 3 decades, Gone with the Wind had sat essentially untouched as the highest-grossing film ever released. The Sound of Music dethroned it within about 18 months of its 1965 debut, becoming a genuine global phenomenon in an era with no internet, no streaming, and no viral marketing to help it along, spreading almost entirely through word of mouth and repeat viewings. It went on to sweep the Academy Awards that year, taking home 5 Oscars including Best Picture and Best Director, a remarkable validation for a project that had been dismissed early on by American studios as too corny and too foreign to work. What's remarkable, looking back at all of this, is how much of what made the film so beloved was never actually planned. The dreamy, shadowed romance in the gazebo was a fix for equipment that kept ruining the mood with an embarrassing noise. One of the film's most emotionally powerful vocal performances wasn't even performed by the voice audiences believe they're hearing. A near tragedy in a rowboat became a scene families have watched thousands of times without any idea how close it came to going terribly wrong. And the leading man, delivering some of the film's tenderest moments, spent much of the production wishing he were anywhere else. For decades, the studio had every reason to keep these details quiet, because the illusion of effortless, joyful magic was part of what made the movie so enduringly comforting to watch. It took candid interviews, released memoirs, and eventually a remastered soundtrack, decades after the film's release, for audiences to finally learn what was really happening just off camera the whole time. So the next time that gazebo scene plays, or that helicopter shot of Julie Andrews spinning across the mountaintop rolls by, or Captain Von Trapp sings Edelweiss with tears in his eyes, remember what was actually happening behind it. The giggling Fitz, the frightened 5-year-old in the water, the reluctant leading man, and the singing voice that was never really his. The story audiences fell in love with on screen was carefully, deliberately smoothed over. The real story, the one nobody was supposed to talk about, was a lot messier, a lot more human, and honestly, a lot more interesting. If you found any of this surprising, let me know in the comments which detail shocked you the most. And if you want more hidden stories from behind the scenes of classic films, make sure you're subscribed because there are a lot more of these still to uncover.